a prophetic witness that challenges the negative, evil principalities and powers. This is the church too. This is church on the cutting edge. In our text, the images of a crowd that often just consumes. Y'all heard about the consumer church? When folk come just to get. So in our text, up until this point, when Jesus is handing out food and blessings, the church, those who are gathered together, are just consuming. But not long after all of the crumbs have been gathered, and the mouths have been wiped, and the crowds disperse, Jesus is about to lead the disciples on a journey that they didn't really want to go on, but a journey which will eventually knit them together in ministry as they will be challenged to reach out beyond their comfort zones. What we are about to receive and see in this text is another revelation of how God deals with God's people. Among the 12, at least 4 or more of them were trained fishermen. They had learned to watch the weather. And yet in verse 22, Jesus, he stops comforting everybody, he stops nurturing, and then he challenges the 12. In fact, verse 22 says he strongly urges them. He insists that the disciples get into a boat and sail to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And this sea, around this sea rather, there are small hills and mountains. All around this sea, there are small hills and mountains. And when winds start to whip up, it can be a terrible place to find yourself in a boat in the middle of the sea. And yet, they are made to get into this boat, and they are obedient. While he goes off to a nearby mountainous coastal region on solid ground. Now think about this. Jesus is only about 32, y'all, so it's not like he's 56 and he looks very mature. He's about 32. Some of the disciples could have been older than him, and he tells them, look, I want you to get this boat. Jesus, we can tell we're fishermen. It's getting windy. We don't have, just go. They go, and what does he do? He walks on dry ground, goes up into some mountains, and begins to pray. The disciples are in the water facing a storm while he goes off into solitude on dry, safe, and solid ground. And according to verse 24, just as some of the disciples probably had imagined, they find themselves in the middle of choppy, dangerous waters, in the middle of the night and into the early mornings when it is dark and deadly. Matthew says that they were in the middle of the sea, and the waves were what? The waves were against them. They are all together, picture this with me now, they are all together in the boat, but they're also all together in a mess. And what makes it worse, it was a mess not of their choosing. My brothers and sisters, let's think about our experience in the old ship of Zion as black folk. Every one of us has ancestors who have been in a lifeboat of sorts, the church, that was in danger of sinking in very turbulent and difficult times. It was a situation that was not of their choosing, and yet there they were. Now, I wouldn't say that God sent us into this storm, like in the text, but God did allow our people to face it. Have I got a witness? Is that not the truth? God is sovereign, God allows it. As we reflect upon our African ancestors' journey to the Americas and our journey in the Americas, and how we have fought to be recognized as fully human persons and to recover from the near destruction of our social, spiritual, and cultural cohesion. All of that was nearly destroyed when we were brought over here, when we were snatched and taken to South America and Brazil and the West Indies and Haiti and Jamaica and to Great Britain and of course to here in North America. First Massachusetts, then Virginia, As we reflect upon this boat experience, we understand that there has been a whole race of people brought over by ships through the Middle Passage who have had their faith tried and tested and their hearts expanded because we had to wrestle with waves and winds of racial discrimination. Even when God seemed distant, we had to wrestle within our boats. And initially, it seemed like God was nowhere to be found in a very strange and hostile land. Y'all don't mind if I talk a little history, do you? And I think that if we learn anything from Matthew, and if we learn from this painful yet very real history, we will be in a better position to deal with whatever storm we might find ourselves in today, and we will possibly face tomorrow. You know, it is said that if you're not in a storm now, you're either headed for a storm or you're just coming out of a storm. A storm is somewhere in line with your human experience. We've just got to be ready. Because as a people, we were exposed to a cultural tornado. And yet the old ship of Zion has held steady. But before we found this out, we first had to face strong winds, and there were strong winds against us. When I was in seminary, after my first 2 years, I finally took my first class on the black church. This was about 1992, and it was taught by Raymond Brown. Y'all might have heard that name. If you haven't, many of you all knew Robert Brown. He was the interim minister here from 1998 to the year 2000. Raymond Brown is Robert Brown's brother, or was his brother. He passed. But I studied under him in 1992, and he was the instructor of our class on the black church. And one of our books that we had to read, which was really two books, was this book right here entitled The Negro Church in America, the Black Church Since Frazier. The first book, which makes up the first half of this one book, The Negro Church in America, was written by E. Franklin Frazier, a brilliant African-American sociologist who studied at Fisk, who studied other places, studied all over the world. And he put together his analysis of what has been going on in the black church since we made it to these shores. He died in 1958. Some say he died in 1960, but he died around that time. After his passing, C. Eric Lincoln, another scholar out of Duke, he wrote an answer and an addendum to what Frazier wrote years before. And his response was the black church since Frazier. Anyway, these two combined books was the first book which opened my eyes to the development of Christianity among black folk in this nation. Before I read this book and dialogued about it with my classmates, I had no clear picture of how we got our start with Jesus Christ and the role that the Lord and the black, aka the old ship of Zion, the black church played in helping to keep our entire people afloat when the storms of life and death and catastrophe were raging against us with gale force winds. In the first chapter, I read the history of how our people were enslaved. I had heard much of this before. I had seen the movie Roots. I had read portions of Alex Haley's book, along with other books. So some of what I was reading in the first chapter of this work, of Frazier's work, was a refresher. I read about how African-American males, young ones, strong ones, were the first ones targeted by our kidnappers because young black men would bear the brunt of the hardest labor and work. And also because, unlike young women and older men, young black men, according to our slave masters, were the ones who were the poorest carriers of African ritual, African history, our traditions, our folkways, our music, our religion, because the teens and the young men were just learning these things for themselves. So if you got men first, this is in the first chapter of his book, if you got men first, you didn't have to worry about them congregating together and planning how to retain our African culture and strength or religion because they were just learning it themselves. Now, isn't this true still today? Young black men, and I praise God for young black men, but they are often not the ones to ask about black history. If you want to know about black history or Christian history, why? Because our focus is on movies, our focus is on hip-hop, our focus is on playing games. We're trying to find ourselves, most of us. And that's just the position we're in. That's just the stage of development we're in. But now, when it comes to passing on morality and history and songs and divine wisdom, it comes from first mama's breast, and we learn it in mama's lap, or at the feet of a wise daddy or granddaddy or a wise uncle. It is very rare that we see young men trying to pass on to the next generation what they have learned. So some of what I read was familiar. I read how those who had been enslaved were taken from different tribes in West Africa. Therefore, their ability to communicate with their African brothers and sisters was challenging, to say the least, if not nearly impossible. Because at the time, we had to learn English from those who only wanted us to know certain words, certain phrases, and ideas. This, my brothers and sisters, was a terrible storm that was blowing against us, a tornado of epic proportions. And you know, as I look out in the audience, I am going to say this because I think the Lord is leading me to say this. I see some of our young people, they're tuned in right now to Facebook, they're on social media, and they are hearing something now that will help bring liberty to their minds and hearts. But if you tune it out, you won't experience the freeing power of knowing who you are and where you come from. And then Franklin began to systematically explain how different initiatives instituted by our oppressors were meant to destroy our social cohesion. I'm talking about winds and storms. The way we enjoyed and expressed faith in a creator who moved through nature and through other lesser gods and the ancestors, all of that was denied and rejected and refuted as nothing more than mythology and superstition for a childlike people. I'm just talking history, y'all. This is real history. According to Fraser, there was a systematic effort to destroy our social cohesion. Black folk couldn't gather in groups larger than 5 at a time. This was prohibited unless they were under the watchful eye of their slave masters. The way that families were broken up, romantic partnerships were broken up, marriages broken up, the bonds of the nuclear family were intentionally and capriciously broken up, separated and broken down. My, what a storm. The way the names were changed and education was denied. It was not good for black folk to learn too much about what was in those books that whites were reading, so education was denied. And all of this is chronicled in the first 13 pages of Franklin's groundbreaking work. And it records the storms and the strength of the wind that was against us and the level of spiritual darkness that surrounds us. But from out of this stormy darkness, just like the disciples in Matthew 14, Jesus might have seemed distant, might not have even known to have been in existence, but Jesus was watching all along. And in a very real sense, he started walking toward our people. A new hope for a new social cohesion. A new hope for a new society. A new village would be formed because Jesus started showing up first faintly. Yeah, the image of Jesus was faintly, like when he was walking on the water and the disciples thought they were seeing a ghost. To our people at first, the image and understanding of it was faint. It was faint, but he was moving toward us. And in the 1600s and 1700s, while we were primarily on the East Coast, a new hope, a new foundation, a new source of joy, a new common language, music, art began to emerge slowly but surely. I know, not from this book, from other accounts though, and other readings, that Jesus started showing up in spite of the strange European and sometimes unsympathetic witnesses, the missionaries who first mentioned his name to us. Jesus showed up anyway, even though they were exposing us to a twisted form of Christianity, which was meant just to make us servants and slaves. While we were new to the East Coast and just starting to be taken south to deal with cotton and tobacco history, y'all, some Dutch Catholics and missionaries from the Church of England started telling us about a captain, the captain of souls. And they started telling us about a new kind of ship. At least this is the way many of us heard it. They told us about a Messiah whom we later learned had spent some time hidden in Egypt as a baby. A dark olive-skinned Jew named Jesus, who had grown up in the ghettos of the Roman Empire. One who went about, I'm talking Bible now, y'all, who went about the cities, towns, and hamlets preaching with power and filled with the Spirit of God. A man who claimed to be much more than an ordinary man, who went about loving those who had been hated and rejected by others, and even loving the haters and those who were doing the rejecting. A man who went about doing good and healing all of those who had been oppressed by the devil. A man who could speak to any storm and make it shut up and calm down. A beautiful man. I'm talking about a beautiful man. We started hearing about a beautiful man in an ugly situation. He was beautiful because he was good through and through. And like Plato said, goodness is the highest expression of beauty. He was a beautiful man because he was good through and through. The Bible says